Dzień dobry. Jo, na po I studied Hungarian for 3 days before I came here, and I crammed 2 textbooks into my head in 25 days. There's John, he knows how it feels. We studied together. Had an interesting effect on my brain. Okay, so this subject I think is something you see often in polyglot discussions. Maybe not written in such an academic way, but it's the potential effects of language switching between language on your self-concept or your identity, who you think you are, and personality expression. So we're going to examine the so-called scientific evidence here. Okay, so first I have a question. Just if you show me by raising your hand, do you sometimes feel different when speaking certain languages? Not everybody, but majority. Okay. All right, so multilingual, multicultural individuals may experience a change in perceptions, feelings, judgment, and behavior when switching from one linguistic cultural context to another. Now you're going to see that I continuously put the two together, right? Language and culture. I say linguistic, cultural context. It's very important here. Okay, so it's modulated or it's affected, increased or decreased, by the degree of proficiency. And importantly, the degree of assimilation, the cultural part, of norms, values, assumptions, beliefs, expectations, and perceptions of the culture associated with the language you're switching into. Okay, so I asked you to raise your hand. Some people didn't raise their hand. Either they weren't listening or they don't like to exercise. But, or it's not at all for them. Okay, if it's not at all, then maybe you won't like my comments here, what it means, okay? So what determines that? All right, so first of all, how did you acquire that language, that particular language that you're switching into? Was it only with learning materials, you know, very bookish type? You're going through various applications and such. You never really spoke with anybody. You never used the language to get by in life, etc., or relationships, on and on and on. Okay, so in that case, weak or non-existent. Even though you may be able to pass a test and say I'm B2, or I don't know, was it B2, C1, things like that, the higher ones. You could pass that test, but yeah, it's non-existent for you because it's just here in the head, and the culture hasn't perhaps come with it. It wasn't a package. Okay, so then maybe use very common, use learning materials, and also you use the target language with native speakers. So it should be more significant, again, depends on how much. Or you have then, at the other end, extensive interaction in the culture of the target language. So you lived in the country, etc. Okay? So the more this is true, the stronger it is. Okay? The more this one is true, the continuum here, then the weaker, more non-existent. Okay, so next observation is how closely your accent, prosody, and communication patterns are similar to the native speakers of that target language. So successful native-like accent and prosody makes it strong, this possibility, okay, whether you feel it or not. The use of native-like body language and gestures. So when you're communicating, do you also imitate that? The similar communication patterns. So for example, in some cultures, you can talk while the other person is talking, and others, extreme Finnish culture, you hear it, you wait, then you say something, okay? All right, so, and the degree of your emotional awareness of yourself and others, the degree of your social sensitivity and skills, the degree to which you have developed a new linguistic cultural identity in the target language. And this one we're really going to focus on this one in this presentation, okay? Because if you've developed this, you've done all the other, okay? You can't develop a deep cultural linguistic identity without a lot of interaction in the target language. And the degree okay, I just say it differently here, of your language, culture, ego permeability. So we're going to discuss what that means. Okay, so this is Quiora, very interesting researcher. Like he used alcohol. He used in the States we call them downers, like tranquilizers with people to see if they could pronounce Thai language better. And they could if they were hearing it from a native speaker and not a machine. Okay, the significant difference came when there was emotions. Okay, so I mentioned that because then you understand this better. Because I'm distinguishing between acquisition without the kind of human and emotional contact and just cerebral acquisition. So, okay, perhaps you've read all this already that I've been talking, but I'll read it again. Second, language learning in all its aspects demands that the individual, to a certain extent, take on a new identity. And in order to have a permeable, meaning so it's kind of somewhat open and flexible, language ego boundaries, you must first have a well-developed, integrated ego or sense of self in the first language. So the development of this language ego directly parallels that of the general ego development. In the early stages of development, the boundaries of the language ego, I'm having hard time with that word, are in a state of flux, and hence the pronunciation ability is quite malleable. One clear manifestation of this is a child who doesn't have a well-developed ego boundary, and therefore they seem to be able to imitate the accent, prosody, etc. much easier. Okay, there are a number of books which talk about this. Here's one example. And individual variations in ability to approximate native-like pronunciation are in part determined by certain psychological variables, which are under the concept of this ego boundary or empathy and the permeability of ego boundaries. Okay, here's a long one, but it's very interesting. Now, McGilchrist is really talking about left brain, right brain here. And it's an extremely interesting book. But if you really want to get into this subject, I think he says so many good things about this, even though he's not talking about foreign language acquisition, etc. He says communication occurs because, in a necessary, limited, but nonetheless a crucially important sense, we come to feel what it's like to be the other person who is communicating with us. So this explains how we begin to pick up, their habits and their tics, even if we don't want to, and explains the problems of emotional entrapment in the conversation. Like it would be in therapy. You start to feel the same problems. If you speak to negative people all the time who are telling you the problems, you know how you feel, right? Okay, so we in everyday life, when we experience in our own frames the very feelings that the other person experiences. So empathy is associated with a greater intuitive desire to imitate. Okay, and now let's talk about the strong link between language and culture. Because at the beginning I pointed out the degree to which you feel different in a different language is going to depend on how your acquisition has been associated with the target language culture. So looking at the relationship between the two, we can take a look at some quotes. Okay? Through the study of other languages, students gain knowledge and understanding of the cultures that use that language. In fact, students cannot truly master the language until they have mastered the cultural context, because the communication rules which are embedded in the culture. So language learners must be aware of the cultural and the social norms and conventions that encapsulate the communication process. And I do realize that I think my choice of words may seem hard for non-native speakers of English, but I'm quoting here. So I could have rewritten it perhaps, but I hope you follow. Meaningful cross-cultural communication requires the ability to understand different modes of thinking, how people think in that culture, and ways of living. And they're embodied in the language cultural Gestalt. Okay, we'll borrow that from German. It's a good word to express it. And you have to navigate between different modes present in any specific interaction, what's going on at that time, the situation. And this ability is labeled as intercultural communication competence. Okay, so language expresses the cultural reality in that with words people express not only their facts and ideas, but also their attitudes, perceptions, perspectives, and values. And also in language we have the cultural reality in which people give meaning to their experience through the means of communication. And it symbolizes cultural reality since people view their language as a symbol of their social identity. Okay, so perhaps you've read some things about Sapir. I'm not going to get in heavily into linguistic relativity, mainly because it's been butchered by people who don't understand, who are monolinguals. And it's not linguistics, and they don't really understand this whole experience, and they try to, Chomsky threw away culture and just wanted to look at language as a computational function. Okay, but if you look at a different light, it's extremely insightful that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up in the language habits of the group. So no two languages are sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality, construction of the social reality is something that's indisputable. Whether we're talking about perceptual reality in general, that's something else. Okay? So the words in which different societies lie are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. So multicultural and multilingual individuals can be thought as having multiple self-concepts, multiple ways of thinking about themselves, or a cultural linguistics identity, and each related to the language that they know. And then again, how developed this is depends on your experiences, your ability in the language, and how close do you imitate a native speaker? Okay, if you hear somebody who sounds very much like a native speaker in a particular language, you can sure bet that they also have the culture deeply within them. Okay, so multicultural individuals often need to navigate between different norms and values associated with that language and culture. And multicultural individuals possess at least two cultural frames. Okay, so bilingual, each based on a corresponding set of cultural experiences and knowledge. So one of the reasons that accounts for feeling different when you're speaking different languages is that the language can be a cue that activates, a prime, that activates these cultural frames, these schemas, which are developed in that culture, target language and culture. It comes to the forefront at that time. So cultural frame switching refers to the idea of interpretive frames, schemas, ways that we try to understand the world. In individuals who have internalized two cultural identities, they can shift with these situational cues. So these cultural schemas guide behavior only when they come to the foreground of one's mind. So it doesn't mean that, okay, so I've lived most of my life in Japan. 38 years. But right now, I'm not really feeling Japanese, okay? But it's very strong, and sometimes I hold it back, you know? So when I see people, I often do this. If you see me and people go, hey, and I go, like, okay, you just understand that, all right? But it's something brings it to the forefront, which could be hearing the language, seeing something that represents that culture. We'll get into that. Okay, so, I already did that. Okay, so here, an experiment, actual experiment. When exposed to Chinese primes, priming the language, bringing it forward, for like Chinese Americans who actually speak Chinese. Okay, again, when you look at this, if you look at a Chinese American, Japanese American, or Latino American, whatever, if they don't speak the language, it's not as strong. Okay. So, like they see a dragon or Chinese calligraphy, they're going to respond one way. So, Chinese American biculturals make more external attributions, comments about what they're looking at. And this is a typical Eastern style. However, if they're exposed to American primes, then they make more internal attributions. Okay, so in psychology and cognitive science, a schema describes, same frame, schema, describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and relationships among them. So we're exposed to extreme array of complexity in the number and kinds of stimuli at any moment, that we're awake and paying attention, to which people can pay attention. So you have to choose what you're paying attention to. And people create mental schemas or scripts that simplify the environment by reducing its complexity. Sometimes I doubt my English, so forgive me. The perceptual schemas assist in the automatic processing of information and guiding our interpretation, how we understand it, how we respond to a familiar social situation. Okay, and they're based on values and expectations. Expectation meaning what the person you're talking to expects in terms of behavior and reaction, etc., and the way you might see something. Okay, so these differences in values among cultures lead to differences in perceptual filters, what you're focusing your attention on. So what people pay attention to is how they interpret what they notice. Okay, so I mentioned linguistic relativity, and what language and culture together tend to guide you to your attention. That creates your reality. Your reality is created by what you pay attention to. And the more people identify with the language and culture, the greater they experience emotional sensitivity toward the language and culture. There's greater emotional attachment and reaction to stimuli representing the culture. So interaction in a specific culture and language develops memories that have emotional valences or values, okay? So when you have this memory, you have a strong feeling that goes with it, all right? So looking at my past, over 45 years I've been around the world. I left the States in 1974. And I can remember like my Brazilian experience. I really got into Brazil and I loved the music so much. And then for a number of years, once I heard any Brazilian music, then it all came to me, the emotions, I felt them, the experiences I had. I had a good time in Brazil. Okay, so I was young. Luna studied groups of Hispanic women who were all bilingual. Another scientific evidence here. But with varying degrees of cultural identification, how much they identified with being Latina. They found significant levels of frame switching, so changes in how they saw themselves, self-perception or self-identity, corresponding to high levels of biculturalism. Okay? So their ability in the language, not only the ability in the language, but also their identity to the culture. So those Hispanics with high levels of participation in both Latino and Anglo culture, when cued with a particular language, English or Spanish, these individuals activate distinct sets of cultural specific concepts or mental frames, which include aspects of their identity. So those mental frames may consist of different repertoires or sets of values and behavior. What's appropriate value? How do people in that culture look at it? How do they behave in that situation? As well as separate worldviews and identities that are entwined with the language and culture, specific to the memories and experiences that they have. Okay, so you see why if you've only studied the language, in the context of your room or something on a computer and didn't interact, wow, this is extremely important. Okay, so what happens? So culture and corresponding linguistic identities may be stored in separate knowledge structures and activated by interaction in the language and culture. Or again, as we saw in the case of the Chinese experiment, just primed, activated by seeing calligraphy or a Chinese dragon or something. Okay, so the emotional value or valence of the particular culture or language based on a meaning system and framing it that is part of a repertoire of meaning systems. So language is a meaning system. The language and culture together, is a meaning system. In a multicultural, multilingual individuals may vary according to their linguistic and social cultural context of the moment, of that particular moment, okay? So interacting in a particular cultural language tends to bring this emotional value or valence of the meaning system, framing associated with that cultural language to the forefront, and causes emotional valence of other language to recede, to go to the back, okay? So it's a change of dominance. So when you say you feel different, it's a change of dominance at that time. So language does more than simply cue what cultural frame we adopt. It also may determine what comes to mind, what do you think of. The cue memories that determine what we pay attention to. And it influences our ability to draw distinctions. It affects our perception of our behavior and our attitudes. So various studies show that those who speak more than one language perceive the world differently depending on the language being spoken, affecting not only their thoughts but also their preferences. So users of both Spanish and English complete a questionnaire to measure the big 5 personality dimensions. Okay, so extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, and neuroticism. Once in English and once in Spanish. And the researchers observed that the same pattern across 3 separate samples. When the participants completed the English version of the questionnaire, they tended to score higher on extroversion. It's relative, okay? Higher on extroversion and agreeableness and conscientiousness, and slightly lower on neuroticism. So if you're Latino, you're more neurotic compared with when they completed the Spanish version. From an Anglo culture, you're neurotic, not from your own culture. That's why psychology, I go to conferences, cross-cultural psychology, where we deal with these things. And if you talk about, there was a discussion here, right? What was it called? It was linguistic hegemony or something like that. Okay? Yeah, it's minor, cultural hegemony, but they're together, right? The researchers claim that there were no profound changes in personalities when these bilinguals switch languages. Instead, they become more extroverted. So it's relative. They become more extroverted in that language when they speak English rather than Spanish. But they retain their rank order within each category. Okay? So it's a matter of degree here. They haven't become it's not Jekyll and Hyde. They haven't become a different person. But the degree to which it's expressed is different. So the results are consistent with thousands of monolingual participants who spoke either English or Spanish, and that showed English speakers tended to score higher on those three: extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And analysis confirmed that these effects are not related to translation issues with the questionnaire, but they're related to cultural frame switching. And Irvin administrated the thematic, is that spelled correctly? Anyway, in French and English, to French-English bilinguals using the same pictures. Okay, this is interesting. Okay, yeah. All right, what happened? So they're writing in French, they're writing in English. Achievement themes were more commonly found in English stories among female bilinguals, whereas verbal aggression against peers, autonomy, and withdrawal were common in French stories. Watch out for those French ladies. Okay. So in addition to cultural frame switching, cultural accommodation and cultural mindset are related explanations for this effect. Okay? Cultural accommodation simply means that you accommodate the cultural norms. Okay, you're in Rome, do as the people do in New York. No, that's not how it goes. Okay. So you're just accommodating this. So cultural accommodation simply, no, I read that. Yeah, okay. In other words, language itself primes the multilingual's cultural specific values, attitudes, and memories, which in turn affect their behavior. Okay, so the perceived cultural norms of the group associated with the language in use activate behavioral expressions of personality that are appropriate in that situation. So some people might find that speaking a foreign language sets them free. This is a very probable feeling if someone obtains a high level of proficiency in the target language in conjunction with the development of this new linguistic cultural identity. And it comes to the forefront at a certain time, and then you feel free in the way you express yourself. I know I do it all the time, because when I'm speaking Japanese, it would be very different than when I'm speaking Brazilian Portuguese or even English or German's one way, and etc. Okay, Italian and German, right? Or Finnish. I don't speak Finnish, but I'm just, they show a certain tendency which goes to the other extreme. Okay, so part of the freedom comes from the absence of expectations that are present when you interact with people. Okay, so if you feel free when you're interacting in a certain language which is deeply within you, you identify with it linguistically and culturally, okay, then you might feel this absence of expectations about how you should act, who you should be, etc. So in such a context, you are not only subject to the norms, values, and attitudes and expectations of the culture in general, but also to the expectations of those who know you well. Your past history with those people is an anchor. Oh, very important one. The most important slide here. Okay, I've been teaching here 29 years, this university. You have to come see it, okay? All right. Yeah, I'm ready for questions. What time is it? Oh, wow, that was fast. Tomorrow, I don't know how I'm going to fit it all within 30 minutes, so it might go longer. Yeah. Where's the question asker? Okay. Yeah, I think first we have to go with this. Yeah. I take off my glasses to read this distance. Okay, let's see. So, how about the people in autism spectrum learning languages in which, with such an ease while perhaps having difficulty in social sensitivity skills? Okay, but first of all, it depends on autism, such a broad spectrum, so it's very hard to answer that question. But because when you have extreme autism, your language doesn't develop in general, because you don't share. If you read Tomasello wrote about acquiring language knowledge, basically the syntax, etc., through usage, and it's at the point in which a child shares perception with the parent and such, where they start to make the most progress. So it's a hard question to answer, but what you can say is that usually those with asparagus or syndrome, etc. Did I say it right? It's not the vegetable I'm saying, right? Okay. Asparagus, yeah, I was thinking of a vegetable. They tend not to speak with native-like prosody, and pronunciation is one issue, but native-like prosody, etc. Okay.
What does it mean for your personality if you grow up multilingual?
Well, I think when you grow up multilingual, I think you definitely experience this. If you grow up multilingual, multicultural, which would usually make sense, I think you experience this, but if you're not aware of it, it's just because it's too natural. Is there another one? Yeah. It's not on here or something?
You mentioned a difference between hearing language from a native speaker or a machine.
Yeah.
What about recordings of native speakers?
Oh, yeah, well, that's what it was in that experiment, okay? Griora gave the subjects one time alcohol, another time downers, I forget which one. So basically tranquilizers. And they were hearing recordings of native speakers speaking Thai, okay? And it wasn't there. It doesn't matter what. If it were a machine sound, of course it would be even worse, but the machine sounds really, Oxen Pasatai Yak Mak Le. Okay, I'm speaking Thai now. You can see the pronunciation is not so easy, 31 vowels, etc. A lot of sounds, even the consonants, we don't have in Europe, but you have them in like a Hindi or Vietnamese, etc. Okay, so it's a language which, if you only speak a European language, you have a lot to deal with. You what? Slido, afterwards. Okay.
Do you have any examples from when certain primes have affected you, so that you frame switch in the wrong way in a certain environment?
All the time, so. Yeah. Mostly it happens with momentarily things, so interjections and such, so excitement, emotions. It depends which language I had been speaking recently, but since I spend most of my time in Japan, it's going to be how I might react to something verbally or physically, right? So it might be this. Okay, so it looks a little funny, even though it may not fit. That's the way you might have reactions to certain things that have emotional stimulus. Did I get this question right? I think that was what you were asking.
That was it. Okay. Do you pick languages because you like their social reality? What about when you start learning a language and find its social realities clash with your core?
So basically the values clash with my core. There are languages I prefer over others because of that. Yeah. I haven't stopped learning any languages because of that. But it depends. Most of my language involve experiences in the language or culture. Some which I'm still at a lower level. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Hungarian, because so just 3 days in Georgia this time. But I started studying Hungarian in Poland 39 years ago, but didn't get to a high level. But I listened to a lot of Hungarian music and had relationships in Hungarian, and not in Hungarian, in Russian at that time, because my Hungarian wasn't good enough. So I've had experience with Hungarian culture. but there are, my Hungarian is still a low level, but there are languages which I'm still a low level, but I haven't had the cultural experience yet, and, you know, it's not developed. I really can't react to it so much now, but I've lived in various places over the last 45 years and traveled and such, and so definitely I have preferences. I don't want to name them at this point, okay? This is recorded, and...
How does one deal with the feeling of being a fake when living in a foreign language or culture and having integrated with... lost it.
No, I got it. It's the question of being a legitimate speaker of a language, okay? So, yeah, that's a real heavy one, because let's say you live in the culture for quite a while, and in your interactions, if you really try to blend in, you're trying to avoid any indication that language is not your mother tongue, or some people don't carry their accent the whole time. Kissinger, you could tell he was German, right? Okay. Yeah, so some people don't care, or they want to keep it. I knew a French guy who he said, yeah, you know, the girls like the French accent. So, yeah. And he always kept the French accent, you know, because he liked it, okay? So, but if it was important to you to have others feel that you are a native speaker of that language, a legitimate speaker of that language, then yeah, I mean, yeah, you get that issue. But you can also get it in a monolingual context. Okay, just take Britain, for example. They've done studies and asked British people. British people sometimes, in certain situations, try to speak in a more posh way. But generally, they feel fake. Okay? Yeah. So it can happen in your own language. It can happen, you know, it doesn't have to be a foreign language. Did I get all the question? I don't remember.
There's so many questions.
Okay.
I grew up trilingual, and for me, it's hard to identify with any of the cultures. Does that mean, what does that mean for my personality?
Where are you? Where? Who gave the question? I want to know what the languages and cultures are, how different they are. Because that would be meaningful, right? I mean, yeah. What language, what cultures? Ale proszę, ja mówię po polsku i też Czech może rozumieć, kiedy ja mówię, tak? No, to jest bardzo blisko. It's very close, okay? Niedaleko. So, yeah, I don't think you're not going to see major differences. When you don't see major differences in language or dialect, you tend not to see major differences in culture, okay? So, when it becomes, if you had extreme differences, then if you look at the children that kind of grow up in international schools around the world and such, then it's a totally different thing if it's been different environments. And you get a number of reactions to that. You get those who pull back and don't learn the local language and stick with English or some other language their friends are speaking. And you get those who go forward into, I'm supposed to walk over there, get into the culture, yeah.
I have an extreme example, Texas and Michigan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, because okay, so let's. It doesn't say anything about your personality per se. You know, it's just certain how you react to. I don't know whether you're asking me whether, okay, I don't perceive what you're talking about, or it's that. Would you say I don't feel a part? What was in there? No, that was the question before. I don't identify with any of them. I usually don't identify with being American. I mean, whatever an American is, because there's so many, different kinds. I mean, yeah, identify with. I'm really into it at the time. Yeah, okay, so you're bringing up and saying the U.S. is a monolingual situation. So take an example where, let's say you have a teenager and 12 years old from Boston who speaks with a heavy Boston accent goes to Austin, Texas, which has a heavy Texan accent, and goes into middle school, and all the kids kid him because it's not even a neutral accent, it's a Boston accent, which is very strong. And so he has to make choices. Am I going to switch to a neutral way of speaking or imitate those I'm hearing? imitating those that he's hearing involves that, what we came up, the fake question, because he doesn't sound legitimately like somebody who speaks like that. Okay? So it's a hard process with a lot of emotions involved here with identity. And so let's say then the decision is to sound like a local, and they do, but what happens when he goes back to Boston for a short vacation and he can no longer do his Boston accent, at least in some situations, and they're crossing over and mixing up, and people are going to look at him like, you don't fit, what happened to you, man? I can't do a Boston accent, okay? So, but I'm saying, there's that reaction.
Can you give specific examples of frame switching? Can you list or explain?
Examples of frame. Yeah, can I give specific examples of frame switching? No. No, I could. I just don't, I hesitate in grabbing one and saying it because it could be significant or non-significant. But just keep in mind what this frame switching is. It depends on, because in order for me to give you an example, you have to be extremely familiar with the different cultural context and how significant it is to act differently at that time. Okay? So I could give you an example, so what type of thing. But just think of it this way. Does your behavior, when you switch into a certain language, and okay, so like at a conference, when you see somebody, what is it? Are they coming from a culture that likes distance, it's just a shake of hand, or they like hugs and kisses on each side, things like that, etc.? How do you react? And some people are in between that way, and what is the correct way for me to interact with you? Body language, etc., etc., etc. What's appropriate, on and on. This is constantly coming up, but that's also an individual choice, right? But in culture, we see generally in the culture it's there, all right? So, yeah, you hear the language, and then where you're physically, etc., tone of voice, all those things fit with that situation. That's frame switching. Okay? Is that you get what I'm saying? It's not a problem. It doesn't exist. It exists too much, and also you really need to think about it and see it. I know you experience it all the time, so just think about it yourself. And the more you do, the more you understand it. We're getting hands over here. So no more. Yeah.
Well, one more question, maybe. What is your motivation to learn languages? Because everyone is talking about how you learn languages, but what is your motivation? Why?
I did a presentation last year, if you could watch that one. It's a making of a hyper. Yeah, because it's too big of a question if I just say one thing, But basically, it's from the heart more than anything else. Passion for it. I like diversity, I like stimulation, etc. I like getting to know people with different cultures and views, and on and on and on and on and on and on. So therefore, in my case, I've gone through very different languages and culture. And again, the longest I've experienced is Asian culture. Function mainly in Japanese, also Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, more recently much more Nepali, etc. Getting more into Tamang, the Tibetan languages, in recent years in trekking. So it's like I just can't get enough of it, especially when the reaction of the people is so warm because I've legitimized their culture and their language, and that comes from very small language like Tamang and Sherpa and things like that, where you relearn the minority language. And it's a great stimulation. And okay, I notice whenever I interact with people, for example, when we were in Budapest during this language course, so I'm with Christina, Now, Christina, how did those people react when I saw a group of people walking by us and we all said, about 10 people, right? And so, it's like, where are they from? And I said, oh, yeah, the Kazaki. And then she looked at me, and so I said to him, "Vi Kazaki, huh?" So yeah. How do you know? And the fact, or like, sometimes I don't speak the language. I don't speak Kazaki, but they're speaking Russian. But the way they spoke Russian, the way they looked, etc., I said Kazaki. Been in Kazakhstan, so I knew. Or like I see Somalians, so I do that from facial features and general behavior. So you're Somalian. How do you know that? Well, I'm sure many of us are used to doing things like that. And so you get this extreme connection. So those people, we spend around 10 minutes taking pictures and such, and then they, have to have my Facebook, etc. Well, same on a bus coming here the other day. I met a guy from Nigeria, a speaker of Igbo. I don't speak Igbo, but when I started getting in talking about Nigeria, etc., and I said I want to learn Igbo, trying to get off the bus. No, wait, what's your Facebook? So people react very positively when you show interest in their culture, etc. Especially when it's not such a major language. Yes, we still have time? What? Cut it off? Okay, well, I'll be around to answer any questions. I have to meet with Richard in about 30 minutes to talk about Fukuoka, where I expect all of you to be. Now, Japan is not more expensive than Western Europe, like Germany. Well, a little bit more expensive here for food and such, and accommodation. Find a cheap flight. See you there. Thank you.